Okay, so let me start this review. Let me actually just turn this on for a sec. Give me one moment. And what we're going to end up doing here is I want to go through really what's the most critical part of this workshop, which is really the data access layer. And it's something that, it should be fairly new to you that you might not have seen before. And this is basically what I had put up for this solution. Again, an incredibly minimal version, which in fact, what it does is, if I were to go over here and put a tweet in and save it, it would end up taking you to my tweets. And if I tweet it again, I would see this other tweet, and I could go back and I could see everybody's tweets. Okay? So, what I'm going to focus on here is really this part of the application, which is really the meat and potatoes of the application. The other thing that I want to show you is that by using testing, you can really set up a good chunk of your application without ever opening up a browser window, which is kind of a nice feature to have. Number one, because you really just want to test out your data access layer. You're not necessarily testing out your UI. And also, as a result of setting things up this way, you're going to have tests for your application. Now, again, we haven't really looked at tests yet. You've only looked at tests in the context of writing some code on some checkpoints and that sort of thing. We're actually going to look at it here to solve a problem. So what I'm going to do here is I've got this empty project here. I'm going to initialize it. And I'm going to do an install, and I'm going to install Postgres, and I'm going to install Mocha, and I'm going to install Chai. Those are the only things I need to get done the things that I'm getting done. Again, I'm not focused at all on the Express part of the application, even though, in fact, we are building an Express application. And I'm going to do this not with a ton of tests, although we could do it with a ton of tests. I'm going to keep it relatively simple. So let me open up my Vim here. And we'll start taking a look at it. So one of the things that I want to do to get started is I would like to go to my package JSON. And for my test, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Mocha. And I'm going to use Mocha, and I'm also going to use NodeMon. And so when I go to test, I'm going to say NodeMon / node modules Mocha bin Mocha. When I go to run this, and I go over here to my terminal, and I say npm, and I don't have to say run test because test is something that that npm understands and knows to look in that script file. So if I just say npm test, it'll look in that script file, and it'll come out of here, and it'll say I don't really have any tests to run. And let's go in, and I'll start writing out those tests. So it's going to look, by default, it looks for a folder called tests. And I'm going to call this db test.js. And let's talk a little bit about what we want that test to look like. So one of the things that we're going to need here, again, we're using Mocha. Mocha needs an assertion library. So I'm going to say expect equals require chai expect. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to do a describe and say I'm going to describe tweeting. And what do I want to really describe about tweeting? Well, the big functionality here and the part that makes this the most complicated is, again, the idea that you're tweeting, and we can go back here and look at it. We're tweeting based on a username, which means, again, if I was to go over here and say me, and I go over here, and I went back to this page, I should see this is the ID that I'm printing out here, that it actually finds that user as opposed to putting in a new user where it's going to end up going and creating the user. So what I'm going to end up doing here is I'm going to go and I'm going to describe the scenario that I'm most interested in. And this is going to be where I've got 2 tweets by one user and 1 tweet by another user. That's going to be my scenario. Again, a little bit wordy, but this is what I'm going to end up being interested in. And my end result for this, what I want to find out, is that in the end, what's going to happen here, it results in 3 tweets by 2 users. Right? Seems reasonable? That's what we're sort of looking for. The question is, how do we go and test that out? Well, for starters, just to see that our tests are running, we could say expect foo to equal foo. It's always nice just to get a green test going here, which we end up having, and again, it's watching our tests. Let's think about what we actually want to go and test. What I'm going to put up here is I'm going to put a variable here for my tweets. And I'm going to put a before each over here. And what's going to happen, there's going to be a lot of things that have to happen before I get this going. So let's sort of think about what we need to do. First of all, we're going to assume that we have a database. But let's assume that we have an empty database. And when we go through this test, we're going to want to sync up our database and actually create the tables in our database. That's going to be the first thing we want to do. So if we sort of think about this, and this is going to all be asynchronous. So one thing to note here is if I go and I pass in a variable here, okay, what's going to end up happening is if I go back here, it's going to sit around, it's going to wait. It's going to wait for that done to get called. So by putting in that parameter, what I'm saying is that, hey, look, something's going to take some time. Don't start the test until I'm done with this. So if I go back and I manually go in here and I call done, that's fine, and I'm back in business, okay? Ideally, what I want to do is I want to get these tweets. So my expectation is going to be, just for starters, and it's going to take us a little while to get here, but the length is going to equal 3. And if I go back here, it'll say I can't read length of undefined. But let's say that we go in here and we say tweets equals 1, 2, 3, and we call done. My test will be back to passing. Now, again, this is not really what I want to do. What I want to do is actually go in and have some database layer, db equals require ... /db. Again, this will fail because that doesn't exist. And I'll go back over here and add db.js, and I'll be back in business once again. And what do I want this to do? Well, let's do it just with some words here. So what I want to do is sync, okay? I want to create my tables. I'm going to assume that I've got this empty database, and again, if we set things up with Heroku, we will have an empty database, so we want to have a way of creating our tables. And by the way, this is something that you'll often do in a testing environment where you want to start with a fresh slate. Very often, things can get a little bit complicated, but very often in your tests, you want to start with a blank slate and then populate whatever data you want. So I want to be able to sync, and let me spell that correctly. So I'm going to sync, and after I end up syncing, create a tweet, prof says hi, okay? And when I'm done with that tweet, create a tweet, prof says bye. And when I'm done with that, I'll say create a tweet, someone else says hello. And when I'm done with all that, I want to get my tweets and assign them to this variable. And once I have all that done, right, then my tests will end up passing. So let's actually start to do that. We're going to go in here and we're going to say before each, and I'll say db.sync. And what I want to know is, was I able to sync things correctly? Was I able to create my tables? And so I'm going to pass in here a callback. And I'll go over here and I'll just say, hey, look, if there was an error here, I just want to get out of here. I'm done. But I'm going to actually call done with the error. So one of the things that happens is when you call done, if you call done without passing anything, that's great. It means you're done. You call done with an error, it means there was some error in this process. Again, this is just how this done function works. You're getting past this done function, and what ends up happening is that if you end up calling it without an error, you're going to be okay. Let's comment this out. Again, we don't really have anything, so this is should totally end up bombing out, right? It's telling me db.sync is not a function. So let's look and see what that db.sync ends up doing. And we're going to build this out as we go along. Some of this stuff is going to be comfortable to you. Some of this stuff is going to be new. What I want to do first is bring in Postgres by requiring Postgres. Okay? And I'm going to be working with a database when I end up doing my testing. So I'm going to go back, actually, and I'm going to specify that for my testing purposes, my database URL is going to be Postgres localhost, and I'm going to call this Twitter _ SQL demo test, a database that doesn't end up existing at this point.
Just a quick question. In terms of passing parameters, you can define any variable you want, and they're in your package JSON file, and it'll be passed in to whatever you're running.
Yeah, so here, just to show you this, if I was to go over here, just for the sake of argument, I could go in here and I could say console.log process environment database URL. And if I go back and look at my tests, I should see here's my database URL that's being passed in. But I could pass in whatever I need to pass in. Okay? Right now, I'm not opening up an Express server. I'm not passing in a port. I'm just testing out my data access layer. So what do I want to do once I end up getting in here? Well, I know that I want to do module.exports, and I want to have a sync. And I actually could just do it this way, and I could do a const sync. Again, it's important to realize that this is a function that's going to end up accepting a callback. And if I wanted this to just be done at this point, I could say, hey, look, callback with nothing else. And in fact, constant sync equals this function. And in fact, if I go back here to my test, I could say if an error return done, and just for the sake of argument, I'll say otherwise tweets equals 1, 2, 3, and then done. Okay? So I'm not getting an error from my callback and sync, and I should be passing again. Now, this is not really what I want to do here. What I really want to do when I get in here is when I sync, what I want to do is do a little something different. I want to be able to connect to my database. This doesn't exist yet, but I'm going to do it in a second. I'm going to have a method called connect. Connect is either going to take an error or a client that I could then write queries against. And what I'm going to end up doing over here, I'll say, hey, look, go to connect. Okay? If, in fact, you have an error, then, and I'm trying to keep this kind of short, I'm just going to say, look, I'm done with this. Call my callback with this error. Meaning, what the hell's my point in syncing if I can't connect to the database? Now, again, connecting doesn't exist yet. So let's run this code that's going to do our connection. So we'll have another const connect. Okay? Again, connect is going to take a callback. Either I'm able to connect or I'm not able to connect. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do here is something that you don't necessarily have to do if you're not testing, but if you're testing, it definitely makes sense to do, and it actually makes sense for your code. Now, just sort of bear with me for a moment. What I'm going to do up here is I'm going to define a let, and I'm going to call this client. Okay? And I'm going to say, hey, look, if in fact this client exists, if this client exists, I'm going to call back. I know the client exists. I don't have an error. Null. And I'm going to give you my client. And in fact, if I do that, I'm going to be done with this process. Now, you could ask yourself, that's great, but how do we get this underscore client to exist? Okay? So if in fact the client doesn't exist, what I'm going to do is I'll say const client equals new Postgres client process environment database URL. Okay? And what I'm doing here is I'm creating my client. Now, it's not just that I want to create the client. Okay? I want to make sure that my client is connected to the database. Well, how do you know if a client is connected to the database? You call client connect. Okay? This is not my code. This is the Postgres module. I'll get back an error if, in fact, I wasn't able to connect. If I'm not able to connect, I'll simply do a callback, and I'll call back with this error, in fact, that I was unable to connect. If I'm able to connect and I make it to here, it means, hey, look, I'm in business. I've got a client now that is connected to the database. So now I go over here and I say, here's my variable client. Client equals this client that I set up here, which is now a connected client. Okay? This just basically says, hey, look, I might connect. I make it down here, I'm connected. Okay? And once I'm connected, I do a callback and I say null client. So the next time someone ends up calling this method, client has a value, and I just send it back. I only need to connect once. Okay? And I know exactly when I've connected, because I've connected. If I make it down here, this means I've got a valid client. And if I was to go over here and say console.log client, I should be able to see that client. Okay? So let's just see if, in fact, we could see something. So I've got an error here, which is reasonable. The error says you didn't connect. The database doesn't exist. Easy enough to fix. I go over here. I'm connected to pSQL, and I'm going to say create database. Now I've got a database. Again, NodeMon's not aware of this. Okay, now I see I don't have an error, but I'm still timing out here. That's okay, and we're going to start building this out. Now, again, the reason why I go through this is because I don't want to keep on opening up new connections. I don't have to do that. All I have to do is get a connection. When you're building an Express app, it sort of just works. And the reason why it works is that you basically say connect, and by the time that you end up going and loading your web page, you are connected. Okay? But when I'm doing testing, this stuff is happening instantaneously. I've got to make sure I am connected before I start interacting with the database. Okay? So at this point now, I've got a connection to the database. So what do I want to do when I sync? Well, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put together some SQL. By the way, if I went back here and I said callback, null, whatever.
How does anything after the return statement get executed?
How does anything after the return? Well, which return statement?
The one just below the one the line that the cursor is right.
This?
Yes. How do the following two lines get executed?
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. In fact, you're right. If in fact, sorry, that's a good call. If in fact I have an error, thank you. If I have an error, I get out of it. Thank you. That's very important. You saved me a little bit there. Okay. Otherwise, let me get the client. Let me call him back. And again, we're only calling this once, but we are going to call this connect multiple times. Okay. So what I'm going to do here, and again, at this point, I still should be passing, which really doesn't mean all that much. What I want to focus on is that I'm going to sync, and I want to show you that the tables are going to get created. Okay. So what is this sync going to look like? Well, if I end up making it to here, what I'm going to say is I'm going to say const, and I'll say SQL, or I'll say query equals, and I'm going to use my multi-line backticks, and I'll say, and I always get the syntax a little bit wrong, so let me just check myself a little bit here. And I'm going to go over here and I'll say, because again, this is going to get done multiple times. And I'm going to say drop table if exists. What table? Tweets. And also drop table if exists users. Okay? I want to have a fresh state every time I go through here. Go ahead.
So you can do that in that order because users has a tweets has a foreign key to users.
Yeah, in fact, yes. It's a good point. This should probably be the order, right? Because I don't know if it might give you a hard time if you don't do it in this order.
Give me a hard time. I just figured out.
It could very well be the case. Good point. It depends. If you set things up as a foreign key. If you don't set them up as a foreign key, that's fine. We're going to set them up as a foreign key. Good point. Okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create my tables. And I'm going to start out with my users table. So I'm going to create table users. There's only going to be 2 keys here. And I'm going to say ID is going to be serial. Again, that's a Postgres thing. Primary key. And I'm also going to have a name, which is going to be text. And I'm going to also go and I'm going to create a table. And this is going to be tweets. This too is going to have a primary key. So this is going to be ID serial, primary key. And this is going to have content, which is going to be text. And this is going to have a user ID, which is going to be an integer, references users on the ID, right? And that's going to end up creating the foreign key. So this is just my SQL text. And what I'm going to do here is now I have my client, which is in fact a connected client, and I could query my query. And again, all these callbacks take an error and some results. I really don't have any concerns about the results. I only care if I end up getting an error. And all this is going to do, it's not going to really matter for my test, but when I go in and I look at my database, I should see my tables will end up getting created in this code, and this is something that I could end up using. So in this case, I'm just going to do my callback with this error, and I hope that this error doesn't exist. But let's just see what happens here. So again, if this ends up rerunning, okay, I'm going to go to my pSQL, and I'll connect to my Twitter SQL demo test, and I'll look at my tables, and my tables are there. Okay? So this gives me the ability to go in and create my tables. Now, the next thing that I want to do, again, if we go back here, that's probably, out of all the ones, might be the hardest one. But if we go back to our test, what we want to do here, so if we have an error, we're done. But we want to go in here and we're going to do something like db create tweet. What's the tweet going to be? Well, we'll say prof, hi, callback, error. I'm not really very concerned about what that tweet is. I just want to see that that tweet ended up getting created. And I'll do the same thing I did before. If error, get out of there with the error. Let's tell our testing framework, hey, look, we got nothing for you. We got an error. Otherwise, we'll just get our test to pass again. This is kind of silly, but I'm going to bring this up here. And I'll do this. Now again, we don't have any sort of create tweet method, so let's go and create that now. So we go back into our code here, and we're going to end up describing what it's like to create a tweet. So we're going to have not just sync here, but we're also going to expose create tweet. And we'll put a const here for create tweet. This is going to take a name and some content and also a callback, right? All these things are always asynchronous. So what do we want to do when we go and create a tweet? Well, what we want to do is, first of all, we want to make sure that we can end up finding this user. If this user exists, we don't want to create this user. So what if we have something that looks like this? Find or create user by name. And we'll pass in a name. And we'll also pass in an error. And if we're successful, we won't get an error, we'll get a user ID. Because we really want to have a user ID here. Okay? Now again, this doesn't exist here, so we're going to have to end up creating this. Okay? So again, my goal here is to, when I make it down to here, right, again, if I have an error, get out of there, return the callback with the error, but otherwise now I can create the tweet because I've got a user that corresponds to that name. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create this method. This is going to be a const find or create user by name. And I'm going to go in here, and what am I passing in here? I'm going to pass in a name and a callback. And I'm going to use a let here because there might be two queries that I'm going to need to run. And I'll put a let here for my query. And what's my query going to be? Select ID from users where name equals $1. Okay? I don't want to go in here and I don't want to start concatenating strings. And what I could do here is I could say to my query, hey, look, and let me actually, I'm missing a pretty big thing here. Before I end up doing that, let's make sure that we could first connect, right? We've got to connect to get our connected client. Again, at this point, we would expect that we are connected, but we still want to get that client. So we say connect error.client. Again, if we've got an error, we've got no business being here. We're going to return our callback with the error. Otherwise, we go in here and we start interacting with our database. So again, I always have to call connect when I'm interacting with my database. I could have a totally valid connection here. The whole thing is, though, there's no timing issues here. Okay? I'm going to call connect. If the client exists, I get that client back. If it doesn't, it'll end up creating that client and connecting. So once I end up doing that, now I've got my query, I've got my client, and I could say client.query, query. My case of my params here for my name is going to be my name. And again, this works. This is not my code. This is Postgres. I either get an error back or result. If, in fact, I've got an error, I'll return my callback with that error. If I don't have an error, but I don't have any results, I still might have a problem. So what do I do here? I say, hey, look, if result.rows.length is greater than 0, then I'm going to return my callback. I've got no error, but my result.rows 0 is going to have an ID, which is going to be the user ID. Okay? What happens if I make it down here? If I make it down here, it means I've got to insert the user and get that user's ID. So I go over here and I say, well, let me change my query here. Insert into users, name, values, $1. That's my query. And I say client.query, query. My parameters are going to be, again, my name. And here I'm either going to get back, again, an error or a result. And I'm going to go over here, and by the way, if I want to get back the ID, if you remember, you say returning ID, and now I'll go over here, and I'll say, look, if in fact there was an error, return callback error. I don't really expect this, but just in case it happens, we'll be able to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that I was able to insert a record here, and I'll say callback, null, no errors, result.rows, 0.id. So either I'm going to get a callback because the user exists, okay, or I'm not going to get a callback, excuse me, or I'm going to end up creating the user. Either way, I should have, at this point, a valid user ID. Now, again, we want to just see if that works. Let's do a console.log, user ID, and let's just see if we get something that makes sense. We see we have an ID of 1 over here, meaning that that user ended up getting inserted. We made it down that far. So once this is done and we have a valid user ID, then I can start setting up my query. Create tweet. My query is going to be insert into tweets. What am I inserting into? I've got a user ID and I've got content. Values, $1, $2. I don't want to have to concatenate anything. And here, I'm going to actually have to go in here and specify connect. And I'm going to connect. I'm either going to get an error or a client. Again, this client could be, at this point, we would assume that's an existing client already. But just in case there's an error, return our callback with the error. If not, we're going to tell our client, let's move this down here. This probably makes a little bit more sense. We've got our valid client. Our client has the ability to query. We're going to use this query, and we're going to have to put the right values in here. So we've got our ID, which is going to be our user ID. And we've got our content, which is going to be our content. And here, we're either going to get an error or we're going to get a result. Just for the moment, let's just assume we don't have much use for the result. And I'll just say at this point, I'm going to do a callback here with the error. Okay? This should tell me whether or not I was able to insert a tweet. Let's just see what happens if this runs. This passes, and just to be sure, let's say select star from users. There I am. Select star from tweets. There's my tweet. Okay? Hold on. Let me just go through this a little bit more. And I'm sure you're going to have questions, but let's actually go through the recording, and then so it just doesn't go too long. So what I want to do here, this really is the kind of meat and potatoes of what you're trying to do here. If I go to my test, what I really want to do here is now I'm basically going to go in here and I'm going to do another one of these. And I'll say this is going to be prof and this is going to be by. And again, I'll go over here and I'll say, hey, look, if you have an error, which I don't expect, return done with the error. Okay? Again, my test should pass, which doesn't mean all that much here. But if I go back here and I select star from users, I'll see I still have one users. Select star from tweets. And I've got 2 tweets by that user. Okay? Let's do one more. So we're going to go dig in here again. And what I'll do here is I'll do another user. I'll say Jordan. Hey there. Okay. Again, this should have the test pass. I'm not really that concerned about the test, but if I said select star from tweets and I didn't have an error, I'd see my three tweets from 2 different users. Okay. The last part of this is that, assuming I make it all the way down here, let's say db get tweets. Again, this is going to take either an error or tweets. I'm going to call this underscore tweets because I've got my other tweets up here. So I'm going to name it with an underscore. And again, if I have an error, return done with the error. Otherwise, I'm going to say tweets equals my 3 tweets, and I'll say done. Of course, I've got a little problem here. I don't have this get tweets function here. So this is probably the easiest of the ones that have to be implemented. Reading data is always a lot easier than inserting data. So I'm going to go down here, get tweets. And we'll say that this constant get tweets is going to be a function. Again, this is going to be asynchronous. I'm going to be passing in a callback. I'm going to need to connect. If in fact I'm able to connect, well, let's say the other way, if I have an error, return, just get out of there, my callback with the error. Again, I don't expect this, but could happen. Otherwise, let's do a const with my query. And we'll do this because we're going to have to do a join here. So what are we going to do? We're going to say select, and we'll say tweets.id, tweets.content, tweets.user.id, and also users.name, right? We want to get the name of the user too. From, we'll start with tweets. Join users on users ID equals tweets user ID. Right? That looks like a valid query. It's going to give me all the things that I need. And I'm going to go over here, and I've got my client now, and I'll say client.query, query. Let me call it QRY, because that's, I think, what I was calling it up there. Let's be consistent. And I'll go over here, and when I query, either I get back an error or a result. In this case, I actually am interested in the result. And I'll go over here and specify, hey, look, if in fact you have an error, you're done. Do the callback with the error. Okay? Otherwise, I'm going to do callback with no error, and I'll pass back my result.rows. In which case, I should have this test passing. Let's just write one more very simplistic test here. And the test that I'm going to do here, just to see that this is actually satisfying my test, is to go over here. I'm going to take this out. And we want to verify that in fact we've got 2 users in here. So we've got 3 tweets, we've got 2 users. Let's do something like this. We'll go over here and we'll say const. I'm going to call this users, and I'm going to take my tweets and I'm going to reduce them. All right, we want to really get comfortable with this reduce function. This reduce function gets past a memo, and we're looping over a tweet. This is a function. And what we're going to reduce to is an object. So this is a good way of actually finding just the unique IDs of the users from these tweets. And what I'm going to do here is just say, hey, look, memo, and I'll say memo tweet dot user ID equals, and I'll say tweet dot name. I don't really need the tweet dot name, but I just want to get a hash because, again, the hash will tell me is another way of, this is just a way of finding the unique user IDs in my array. And what I'm looking at here is I only expect to find 2 users even though I have 3 tweets. And again, if you've used reduce, and you should, we need to return our memo. And what do we expect as a result of this? Well, I'm going to just specify, hey, look, object.keys from my users. This basically is just going to be the keys that are in that structure, that map, keys.user.length to equal 2. And if I end up doing that, that will end up passing as well. You always want to maybe go red first before you go green. So it tells us, hey, you expected 3, you got 2. Let's change this back to 2. Let's make one other minor change. The only other thing we need in this data layer is sometimes we want to just get the tweets for a particular user. Okay? Now, one thing we could do is sort of use some code that we have. So let's actually go over here and we'll say let prof tweets. And we'll go over here and we'll nest one more time and we'll say db get tweets. And what we'll do is we're going to modify this method. This is going to break initially, but we'll say, hey, look, we want to pass in prof. And we're going to get error or tweets. And we'll say, look, again, if we have an error, return done with the error. Okay? If not, let's say prof tweets equals the tweets that we get back from this method. Again, this is going to break because our method doesn't look like this, does not accept the parameter. But let's go over here. And our test is going to actually say expect profs tweets dot length to equal 2. And this is going to break all over the place, which is okay. And it's really breaking because what we really did here is we modified this get tweets, and we're allowing an optional name. And so in fact, if we're going to end up doing that, let's go back and look at our test. And so when we call tweets up here, we want all the tweets, so we don't have a name. We'll pass in null for the name. And we don't see prof's tweets, so let's see what's going on there. Prof tweets, and I think I put an S here. If we do that. And what we're going to see is an error because, in fact, we're not getting all my tweets. We're not getting my tweets, we're getting everybody's tweets. Let's modify our code. Go back here. And what we're going to do is instead of this being a const, I'm going to make it a let because I want to modify it. This is the name that's coming in here. And when I go to query, I'm going to go over here and I'll say a const for params because I'm not going to modify this. So if you're going to modify something, use a let. If not, use a const. And I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to say params, which are params. These are empty params. This is not going to break anything, but it's not going to fix anything either. If I go back here, I'm still going to get that same error. But what I'm going to do here is just go over here and say if name. Well, what do I want to do if there's a name? Well, if there's a name, I'm going to specify that my query is going to equal, and I'll use my ES6 syntax. It's going to basically be $query, okay, where users.name equals $1. Right? I'm passing in that extra parameter. I'm calling it with an extra parameter. And then I'm going to say params. Let me move this up so this doesn't break. My params are up here. And I'm going to go over here and say params.push name. So this allows me to call it this way. I'm going to be modifying my query. I take my query, I put a where clause here. Joining on the users table. I see, does it equal the name that ended up getting passed in? And now everything passes. This is your data access layer. You don't have to do your data access layer with testing. It's fine to do without testing. But you could see that if you end up doing some testing, and this is a lot of stuff in one test, but one of the things that you see is that you could have this test, which now is a valuable artifact for your application that says, hey, look, I'm going to be able to create these tweets with a name and some content, and it's not going to recreate the user. That's what it's testing. It's also testing that I could get the tweets, and I could get the tweets for a particular user. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to post this repo, and I'll also post the repo for the solution, which basically uses a very similar concept to this. But to be honest with you, the Express part of this application is nothing. The Express part, and even if you see here, the Express part of the application is 50 lines and it's very generous at that. This is really the meat of the application. In terms of your views, what do you really have? You're looping over some tweets that ended up getting passed in. Maybe you have an optional user that ends up getting passed in to have the two different views. And again, I will post this solution so you could see it, but I'm also going to post this where you could see how you might end up going about testing your application. Testing your data layer is a fairly easy part of application testing. It might not look easy, okay? And I'll tell you why it doesn't look easy. That pyramid, okay? And this is really why I think this is useful to see. Because I think once you see that pyramid, and once you're exposed to getting rid of that pyramid with promises, you're really going to see why promises work. And we can make this thing really linear. By the way, keep in mind something. This is a pyramid. We're doing one thing before the other. Okay, we're syncing. Syncing we have to do first. Can't interact with our database before syncing. This is logical. Okay? But why should these things be nested together? Why do I care that I end up creating this tweet before this tweet before this tweet? Doesn't matter. Okay? I could purely run those serially. Okay? With callbacks, we can do that if we really wanted to, but it's a pain. Okay? It's really a pain to run those serial. With promises, it's incredibly simplistic. So we're going to end up talking about promises next. The only thing that's not covered in this review is how to add the Express part of the application, but I'll put the code to that. Let me stop the recording, and then I'm going to take some questions.